Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see some familiar names and some new names as well. I know that folks are just getting started or just joining us right now, so we'll get started in about 30 seconds or so. You'll see that the Q&A is enabled. The chat is not. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. My apologies, through the Q&A function. Perfect. So good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to our first in our four-part webinar series, applying a sex, gender, trauma, and equity lens to substance use. Today's webinar will be presented by my colleagues, Dr. Nancy Poole and Ella Huber, on bringing a trauma and gender-informed lens to methamphetamine responses. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we're gathering from diverse territories across Turtle Island. The Center of Excellence for Women's Health acknowledges the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples as the first inhabitants and traditional custodians of the lands at which we learn, work, and play. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas the Credit First Nation, Mississauga, and Wendake-Néo-Monsentio peoples. My colleagues are presenting from the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen and WSÁNEĆ. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. We also want to recognize the people that contributed to this work, including our amazing team at the Center of Excellence for Women's Health, our collaborators from BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, that were really involved in a community of inquiry that thoughtfully built and reflected on this work. And lastly, before I pass it on to my colleagues, we want to acknowledge that we received financial contributions from the Health Canada Substance Use and Addiction Program, and the views expressed in this webinar do not necessarily represent the views of Health Canada. So with that, I will pass it to Nancy to start us off.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, I'm Nancy Poole, the director at the center. I'm going to get us started. Here's what we're going to cover today: a quick project overview, quick look at our scan, quick look at our scoping review, and focus in on number 4, the resources for you all around bringing these lenses to your work. Oh, here is a poll. Now, guess what? We, in getting funding from Health Canada, really promised to try and learn about the effect of our work. So we're going to do a quick poll at the beginning of this and at the end. And we'll share the findings with you at the end. And so if you wouldn't mind filling in these 2 questions now, then that will help us report back to Health Canada. We'll also have a bit of a more fulsome eval that'll come to you via email with the slides and the recording from link from today as well, that will come to you post webinar. But this is just a quick in the moment version. All righty, so let's move on. The first part is a bit about the project and some background, and I just want to start by, with some appreciation of you all around, the work in the substance use field is really, responding to the needs of specific populations of meth users, and especially we've seen it around men who have sex with men. However, we just really feel there's such a big opportunity to further integrate sex and gender factors into our meth responses, and also bring in, of course, trauma, equity, and culture-informed approaches. So this project was meant to advance knowledge on sex, gender, equity, trauma, and methamphetamine use. And so we have done that by pulling together both work from the evidence and also by talking to people who are doing this work across Canada. And, you know, we're really tried to, in the course of it, not only learn what's going on, but think through what can we do to capture it into resources that could be helpful to all the people working in the substance use field in Canada around improving our responses for all genders. So when we started out, one of the things we found was this general thing about stimulant use disorders overall that was done in the US. And I just want to recommend it. It really is a very thick and useful treatment improvement protocol document from SAMHSA. And it stresses, you know, how all the dilemmas we have in the addictions field these days of taking into account both neurobiology and social and environmental factors. To really think, in the case of meth users, about the medical complications of stimulant use and really act quickly on those. But also that there are a bunch of psychosocial interventions that have evidence. And that's what we're going to talk lots more about today as we go on. And they stress that it is important to focus on maximizing access, address ambivalence, offer respectful, person-centered, well thought out and tailored treatment plans, taking into account gender, race, and other determinants of health. And really, they didn't focus as much as we are on the trauma piece, but definitely thinking about trauma-informed. So from the US also has been a quick summary from many, many years ago about how sex and gender matter in substance use. And I'm just going to touch on it as kind of background to what we're going to talk about today. It matters in substance use, not only meth, but all the substances, the sort of mechanisms, the biology, the, you know, genes, physiology, neurobiology, and hormones that make us all different and that really do affect our responses to substances and medications. But then there's the gender side of it, you know, the consequences and impacts of meth use and other substance use is really, you know, really gendered in many ways, related to poverty and trafficking and sexual assault and all the different ways in which these consequences and impacts roll out. And so, you know, as we're thinking about prevention, we need to think about the differences in pathways and risk and protective factors and all those issues around the different genders. And we need to think also in terms of treatment. What are the differences in readiness and the access and outcomes? And of course, always be thinking about parenting and reproduction and the different caregiving roles and biological concerns that play out in that territory. So, you know, the tip thing really did talk a fair bit, for example, about different genders. And I'm just using the example of the women part here. They talked about sex factors in meth use, with women, females beginning meth use earlier and progressing to dependence more quickly based on biological factors. They also talked about sex and gender intersection factors around depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress as being more likely for women. They talked about gender roles like caregiving and gender roles like women wanting to be, you know, seen with a certain body type, you know, as thin, etc. They talked about the stigma of parenting and as mothers with meth use issues. And they talked about how gender relations play out in meth use and women being more likely to be influenced by use. And of course, the bigger institutional laws and policies and practices that affect women, like survival sex work, etc. So they did talk about women really well in this tip. And then we ourselves have also looked at gender issues. And if you just look at the bottom 2 points in the blue there, as we looked at sex, gender, and meth use in one of our earlier pieces that looked at sex and gender influences on meth use, we saw that transgender people are more likely to use methamphetamines than non-trans people, and that men who have sex with men are really also likely to be using stimulants, have trauma issues, and have all of this has huge implications around HIV and AIDS transmission and prevention. So a lot going on as background in the sex, gender, and methamphetamine territory. Now, on the trauma side, we have thought lots about trauma-informed practice in the context of substance use, and really thought about how it is a paradigm for providing support. That's a really important one. And that it's based on these principles of thinking about safety and trustworthiness, thinking about creating conditions for choice and collaboration and connection and control and empowerment. And also really thinking about strengths and skills and how important it is to integrate that in practice. So we're going to build on both those ideas of what we know about trauma-informed practice, what we know about sex and gender and substance use issues here. And, in the trauma territory, we've done lots of manuals and guidance in the past. I know many of you on the call have been involved with us on some of these journeys around guidance around trauma-informed practice related to different aspects of the substance use field. And those are all still available on our website. And we're going to talk more about that as we go along. But just to sum up, we know that it is really important in the substance use field that we be thinking about being gender informed and transformative, trauma informed, culturally safe, equity and wellness oriented, and also harm reducing. And we're just, I'm just stating up front that we're just, because we only have an hour, just spending the focus on the gender and trauma piece of it without in any way minimizing all the rest that's really important as well. So the environmental scan, just as a really quick background, we did look across Canada on what methamphetamine services are being offered. We found 14 programs offered in these different provinces that were using these following treatment modalities: a rapid access addiction medicine clinic approach, an outpatient counseling with contingency management approach, outreach, withdrawal management, live-in treatment, drug courts, and of course, traditional Indigenous and land-based approaches. So we are, as I said, doing some things. Here's 3 quick examples of things we found in the outpatient area. The Queer and Trans Health Collective doing great work in Edmonton. In Winnipeg, the clinic folks working to really tailor the withdrawal management work they're doing, including wraparound care following the 30-day detox program, and the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation just doing great national efforts on creating some resources that highlight the teachings from elders and land-based programming, healing circles, etc. So that's a really quick look at what we saw. We'll get to more examples as we go through. Over to you, Ella.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, so I'll just dive into a bit of an overview of our scoping review. So in the scoping review, we looked at what evidence there is on sex, gender, trauma, equity, and methamphetamine interventions in the academic literature. We looked at papers published between 2015 and 2021, And for papers to be included, they had to either be a single sex or gender study, or if there were multiple groups, they had to disaggregate results by sex or gender. So we started off with 2,736 returns, and then just ended up including 25 in our final review. So what we found is that the impact of sex and gender on treatment outcomes is underdeveloped in the academic literature. But what we did find is that many papers focused on pharmacotherapy, although no pharmacological intervention has been approved for treatment of methamphetamine dependence at this point. And the research on sex differences in responses is underdeveloped in this area as well. We found a range of psychosocial interventions, and often we found that a combination of psychosocial interventions and approaches were used, and even sometimes a combination of pharmacotherapy and psychosocial approaches. Many of the interventions were targeted to men who have sex with men and included HIV risk reduction components to them. And then we did find some evidence that women may benefit from methamphetamine-specific relapse prevention. And for all genders, we found that treating depression through either pharmacotherapy or psychosocial treatments may also have the effect of reducing methamphetamine use. So as an example of one of the papers in the review, this one really shows how a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't always work for everyone, and that gender-informed approaches are really needed. So in this evaluation of an intervention that was designed to reduce depression, methamphetamine use, and condomless sex, they found that men really benefited from the intervention, whereas the women in this sample did not. And the authors really note that interventions for women should address the social and structural vulnerabilities they experience. So in this sample, they did find that women were more likely to be homeless than men, had childcare responsibilities, lower income, more experiences of depression, and they were more likely to be trading sex for methamphetamine. And they also note that the unique context of women's use is important to consider. So including the benefits that they perceive with methamphetamine use, such as pleasure, empowerment, and agency that they might be getting from that. As another example, the rewired intervention is more tailored to men who have sex with men. And this intervention covers a range of topics, including sex and pleasure, HIV and risk reduction, mindfulness, and relapse prevention. And it's also facilitated by members of the MSM community and offers a peer support component after the intervention. So this approach was really found to have a moderate efficacy in relation to reducing meth use, psychological distress, and then some moderate improvements in well-being and readiness to change. And just as a final example here, this program was integrated into family treatment courts, and we really see some trauma-informed approaches being implemented here for families affected by methamphetamine use. So really recognizing that family functioning and family relationships are really important to recovery for parents who use methamphetamine. And there was also some gender-informed components being implemented here with programs offering gender-responsive and trauma-informed programs for parents in recovery. So getting into the resources, we use the knowledge that we gained from the environmental scan, the scoping review, and the discussions with our community of inquiry to create practical resources that are intended to support discussions among practitioners and planners about what is already being done and what changes might be made to better serve people needing treatment or support on methamphetamine use. So we created 4 conversation starters and 1 infographic. And today we're really going to touch on the ones that focus on trauma-informed practice and sex and gender, as well as these 2 resources, which cover specific aspects of trauma-informed care. So mindfulness and then organizational level trauma-informed practice. And all these resources are available on our website in both English and in French. So we'll first talk about the methamphetamine and sex and gender informed approaches sheet. So in this conversation starter, you'll find sex and gender factors to consider when addressing methamphetamine use. as well as some key approaches from the broader substance use treatment field. And then we've also included some reflection questions to really prompt thinking on how sex and gender might be addressed in your specific treatment setting. So yeah, the sheet starts off with a summary of some of the sex and gender factors that affect methamphetamine use and treatment that we've seen in the literature and in practice. And so this table illustrates that there are sex differences in symptoms experienced by males and females who use methamphetamine, and that sex and gender interact, creating different contexts of methamphetamine use for women, men, and gender diverse people. For example, under the gender roles section, we see that both cis and trans women report using methamphetamine to stay alert in unsafe environments. And then in terms of institutionalized gender, we see that treatment access is affected by stigma, discrimination, and structural barriers for gender diverse people. So it's really important to think about these factors when offering treatment for people who use methamphetamine and thinking through how we can leverage this knowledge to then better tailor treatment to address these different contexts of use. And then the resource goes on to really describe some inspiring examples from the substance use field. So one example is the Co-Creating Evidence Project, which was a project that evaluated the impacts of programs that offer wraparound care for women who use substances, including methamphetamine. So these programs offer wraparound care. So they were thinking of a range of supports, so addressing things like food security, reproductive health, and experiences of violence. And Nancy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah. So one of the sheets really dives into this idea of how we might integrate trauma-informed approaches. So it introduces the key principles of trauma-informed practice that I talked a bit about before, around being aware of how trauma is in play, really building a context of safety and trustworthiness, thinking about choice and collaboration and connection, and the particular issues around meth users, around creating that kind of connection, and the strengths and skills enhancement piece. And it offers ideas around some of the strategies for service users who use methamphetamines. And I think, that's one of the most interesting parts of it. And I think the next slide gives a few examples of those. Oh no, here's the principles part. That's on the first page. So, talking about those 4 principles and then thinking specifically what it might mean in the context of meth. And for instance, in safety and trustworthiness, it really thinks about how the kinds of cravings and withdrawal symptoms affect, of meth users, may really affect that sense of safety and creating that kind of environment that will support connection and access and staying with an intervention. So lots to think about in terms of, bringing these principles in and thinking about choice and collaboration is really challenging in the context of meth use in terms of creating enough structure, as well as within that idea of building connection and collaboration, and those different services that we mentioned we saw in the environmental scan have really been challenged by this level of the work, I believe. Now, on the next slide, some of the strategies. Now, we've included many more than are included here, but I think we tried to include what we know about meth and what we know about trauma-informed approaches, and give some examples of where people have pulled that in. And in the second one, around enhancing coping skills, I think it's a really interesting one, that many of the research things that we found around positive affect interventions really have been found to assist service users in coping with stimulant withdrawal and sensitizing them to natural rewards and positive reappraisal types of coping. And, things like the enhancing the seeking safety model with that has sessions that you can use singly or as a group offering, really helps people practice and define coping skills that can be built in and really, really enhance and as an alternative to using meth. And I think that's really especially challenging to thinking about engaging meth users in alternative coping strategies. And some of the resources that are included, the links to resources around the positive affect interventions and seeking safety are, I think, could be really helpful in the context of your work. Interestingly enough, one of the things we found in the literature was where people who were involved in courts, drug courts, or live-in treatment contexts in the States had really come up with a way of doing trauma-informed urine drug screening. So they'd created a sheet around how, re-traumatization can be avoided and participant safety can really be facilitated as you do that particular approach. And it just, to me, really spoke to the fact that we can think through how to bring these general ideas about trauma-informed practice into the specificity of work with meth users and other substance users, and that people are really doing a good job of that. There's a lot of other examples around people have been teaching self-regulation skills and yoga and mindfulness and walking and other skills like that to meth users as well as other substance users to really positive effect. So lots of examples. And when Ella was talking about the Rewired program, I think it's a really great example of thinking about how you specifically address the issues around sex and sexuality and focuses on topics like meth and the brain, sleep and nutrition, HIV and sex, mental health and mindfulness, etc. So I feel like people are finding ways to really pull in these things we know well into applying it very specifically with meth users, and it's really inspiring as we go forth. So that's what this sheet is all about, is naming some of these things, naming some of the strategies that people have pulled in to make trauma-informed and gender-informed approaches integrated and working really well together.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, so another common thread that we saw across the interventions and treatment approaches, both in the literature as well as interest from practitioners and planners in our community of inquiry, was an interest in applying mindfulness approaches for addressing substance use concerns. So both in formal mindfulness activities as well as informal mindfulness activities. And what we found is that mindfulness is really emerging as an effective tool for managing cravings, as well as some of the stressors that accompany cravings, and can really be helpful to integrate after treatment to help prevent relapse. So this sheet really dives into some of the evidence-based mindfulness approaches to treatment. There's some podcasts included with some of the leading researchers, and also provides lots of considerations and prompts for reflection throughout. So as well as offering sort of an overall overview of some of the evidence-based mindfulness interventions that are being used in the substance use field, this resource also highlights some approaches that have been used with specific populations in mind. So for example, the moment by moment in women's recovery intervention has really been found to improve retention in live-in treatment, as well as improve psychological well-being among women who use methamphetamine and also have a history of incarceration. So really promising resource there, both incorporating trauma-informed and gender-informed lens. Then there's the mindfulness-based curriculum for adolescents, which we found in the literature has been really beneficial among boys age 18 to 21 with a methamphetamine use disorder. So what we see there is improvements in their experiences of craving, including helping things like response inhibition, reducing risky decision-making, helping to improve psychological aspects like working memory and cognitive function. And we also wanted to honor on the sheet Dr. Michael Yellowbird's work, which really highlights how mindfulness is both a traditional and contemporary Indigenous practice that can help support wellness and be a really powerful tool in dealing with racism, loss of land, culture, language, poverty. And he really incorporates mindfulness activities as a helpful tool when working with Indigenous communities. And on the final page here, we really offer some practical resources that might be incorporated into practice. So lots of activities that are more formal mindfulness practice. So such as meditations, pre-recorded meditations, or meditations that you can kind of run in a group setting or one-on-one with a client, and also grounding exercises. So things like body scans or breathing exercises, and really also thinking about some informal mindfulness practices. So bringing more self-compassion and acceptance into everyday life and experiences and challenges. And then we also link to some handouts that can be used. So on the right here, you see the Peed Off resource, which is a resource that's come out of New Zealand. And we really think that these can be helpful in handing out to folks who might want to work through the prompts and mindfulness activities on their own time and really take the time to think through how they might choose to incorporate certain things into their life and what might most be beneficial to them. Nancy, back over to you.
Yeah, so finally, when we were meeting with the various provincial people who were working on methamphetamine issues and talking about trauma-informed approaches, they really mentioned that, you know, as we've been thinking more about trauma-informed practice over time, the importance of thinking about trauma-informed practice at the organizational level, at the level of the detox, or at the level of the treatment center or the outpatient clinic, et cetera. And really thinking about how are we supporting workers and whole agencies to have a culture of being trauma-informed, rather than seeing it as something only that is, something we do well within interactions with people who come for service. And so we spent a bit of time talking about it, and I pulled together this list of ideas around being trauma-informed at the organizational level, because I've had the opportunity to teach lots about this at the Justice Institute of BC. So this, rather long infographic gives 8 ideas for being trauma-informed at the organizational level, really recognizing that those things go together, right? Of thinking about how well we are as workers as we try and do this work, and how our organization can be really supportive of that. And so lots of great ideas about what it means to have, great debriefing practices, great training, great involvement of service users, great leadership around communicating about trauma-informed practice, et cetera. So, I think it is one of the most exciting areas that is shifting as we continue to do more trauma-informed practice work over time, is this idea of really thinking about the resilience of us as workers. And I've been reading quite a bit lately about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, which, is that idea of what happens to workers as they're exposed cumulatively over time to people with challenging substance use and trauma stories. But lately, there's been a lot more discussion in the literature about what they call vicarious resilience, which is the other side of it, which is what happens to workers as they see the results of working in a trauma-informed way, and see the resilience of the clients they're working with enhanced and expanded, and the benefits for workers, as well as being able to be connecting to what's working, not only with the focus on the trauma and deficit side. So really, it is so exciting what's going on all around us in terms of the trauma-informed and gender-informed approaches that we're seeing, and love to talk more about all those things with people who are interested. But I guess, our real hope in doing this work with, and thank you, Health Canada, for giving us the money to do it. But really, we saw so many opportunities for developing a much more tailored response to methamphetamine use, both on the sex and gender side and on the trauma side. And we hope that in making these kinds of resources that we have, and the format of a couple of them are these conversation starters with a bunch of questions at the end that may help you, get started in conversations in your teams about how we can really, continue to enhance our practice to bring these important approaches and concepts into play.